The FMS Super Cub 1700mm is sort of a legend in the RC community. Not for any special reason, of course, just because it's been damn near impossible to find in stock for over a year. Compared to the 1300 Super Cub, it's a steal. At $100 more, you get a significant improvement in wingspan, and it's much less frustrating to build if you need to take the wings off, and it flies better by virtue of the fact that bigger flies better. The wing loading is nearly identical too. The 1300 clocks in at 48 grams per square decimeter, and the 1700 clocks in at 2 grams more for 50 grams per square decimeter. So for $100 more, you get a lot more airframe with almost no wing loading penalty. So if you're used to flying the 1300 already, the 1700 feels basically identical. It's just a lot less squirrely in the air and feels more planted in the sky. I personally love it. While the 1300 has its advantages for being able to be transported a little easier and being $100 cheaper without floats, the 1700 offers more value in my view. Let's focus on wiring and setup first. Getting the wings on is super easy on the 1700, but it's a nightmare on the 1300. Plugging the wings in is all you need to do with the 1700. The 1300 requires manually running leads through the fuselage, and then you've got a hellish mess of wires to contend with. It really sucks. On the 1700 and 1300, I'm running a crow and full span flap setup, mostly for novelty's sake. If you don't know what crow is, it's the opposite of full span flaps. Instead of ailerons drooping with the flaps, they point up to act as speed brakes. This setup uses my Turbo Timber Evo programming, so watch the video linked in the top right to listen to me drone on for an hour with a googly hat cam attached to my forehead as I go in depth on this subject if you want to learn more about how to set up advanced wing types and to get a little bit more out of your aircraft. The 1700's stock wheels are a major downside because they're rock-hard plastic and have no grip, so it tends to slide on pavement. And the suspension isn't as good as it is on the 1300. The smaller Super Cub was more recently designed and FMS got its suspension right, so it's nearly indestructible. If you need a trainer to fly or a plane that can take a really hard beating, the 1300 is a better choice. The wing loading is identical between these two aircraft because they fly nearly identical batteries. Aircraft in the wingspan class of the 1700mm usually tend to fly 6-cell packs, but it flies on 4 cells while the 1300 flies on 3-cell packs. Both aircraft are recommended by FMS to be flown with 2200 mAh batteries, but I've personally found that the 1300 Super Cub flies great on 1500 mAh 3-cell packs, and I imagine the 1700 would benefit from a smaller battery too, assuming that you're trying to fly in really confined areas for some reason. A 2200 battery is a great compromise between wing loading and flight time, so I would suggest sticking with it.
Why does it sound so horrendous?
The 1700 sounds terrible on the lower end of the throttle range. You mostly notice this when you're taxiing or when you're taking off. Some bystanders watching me float fly later on remarked that it sounds like an angry cat. And I've heard a lot of motors in my time, and this one is definitely among the worst that I've ever heard. The only motors that sound worse than this are the pusher props on racing wings. If you hate noise, this thing makes a huge racket. Something to consider. If you play around with thrust reverse, you might loosen up the prop nut. This makes the motor sound even worse. If you start hearing it sound even more terrible, land immediately and check it out, otherwise this might happen.
Yeah, that's not supposed to happen. Ah! Yeah, this was loose. So, ooh, that's hot too. So yeah, we gotta torque this back down. That's probably some of the resonating we were hearing. That sounds like crap!
The bigger Cub is fantastic and flies great overall, even with some of the downsides that I've mentioned. While it shares the same foam hinges as the 1300mm, neither have shown any signs of foam degradation with the kind of acro that I like to put them through. Either I'm lucky or FMS has been improving their foam hinges. It's probably luck though, since foam hinges will eventually fail. If they do fail, we recommend nylon steel-pinned hinges, which are easy to install and offer a wide range of motion, plus they stiffen up the foam for a minimal weight penalty compared to CA hinges. Acro flying with the 1700 is crisp and responsive and honestly has too much rudder authority. It'll do anything you want. Knife edge passes. knife edge loops, flat spins, thrust reversed flat spins. Yeah, you heard me right. Tumbles, etc. You get the point. It's an airplane and it does airplane stuff. What makes it fun is that absurd rudder authority. You'll want to consider running at least 30 to 40% expo if you have short sticks. If you got a long stick like me, you can run less expo and not feel like the plane is gonna rudder flip the second you touch the controls. It's pretty stable overall, but it does stall aggressively, and it will enter a spin with elevator input, so be aware of this and keep your turns coordinated and use a little power while you're banking. It won't stall out unless you really fly it poorly. You can fly it in decently tight areas on the SMC 2800 battery that we were using too, including this lake on the side of the runway that's basically impassable at this time of year. If the Cub stalled into the water here, it would be sitting there until November unless I go take a swim. So if you want to fly in confined areas like this, keep the wings level, keep thrust applied, and minimize how much you bank the wings while you're pulling the elevator. Rudder will be your best friend here. It's not easy to stall, but it is possible to do, so keep it pristine and crash-free by following these steps. If you want to bush fly and be in some less than ideal places to fly a plane, use the Super Cub's ample rudder and forward slip into tight spaces. It's super predictable. You can step on that rudder and hold it fully while dipping the opposite wing and it'll sink without generating much airspeed. This lets you get into tight spaces like this lake and fly in places that might otherwise be way more difficult to pull off. This might look hard, but it's actually really easy to do. The 1700 is capable of hovering too. It just doesn't have much punch out, but it can prop hang and torque roll. This is less challenging than the 1300 since the airframe is more planted in the sky and the plane just feels like it was built to do it. I just wish it had 50% more thrust so it could punch out vertically. We've rated the 1300 before, but we'll rate the 1700 as an 8.5 out of 10. The wheels being rock hard, the suspension being somewhat worse than the 1300, and the noisy motor combined for 1.5 points off. Your airspeed may vary and you may not care about these issues like I do. The 1300 is definitely not as good of a value if the 1700 is in stock, so if you want it, pick it up via fmshobby.com and use the codes referral TwoBrosRC for 10% off your first purchase, or TwoBrosRC for $10 off any order of $100 or more. Either one of them is a lot of fun, but the 1700 is just a better value and has a more planted feeling in the sky. It's hard to argue with it. Thanks for watching, and be sure to hop into our Discord server and share your own experiences with the Super Cub. See you next time.